Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Shop Talk, hosted by the Triangle Area SQL Server Users Group. Shop Talk is your sole source for hard-hitting news in the SQL world, and I gotta say, I'm not going to be the first to tell you that that's a really terrible idea because we barely ever do hard-hitting anything and almost never do news. But occasionally we do talk about SQL stuff, so 1 out of 3 is not that bad. But who I have with me is Mike Christensen. How you doing, Heap Board?
Doing well, thanks. Hard hitting IO, hard hitting reads.
I mean, those, yeah. Depending on how many rows there are in there, that it may actually be legitimately hard hitting. Unfortunately, Tracy and Mala could not be with us tonight, but we hope that they'll be back next time around, especially because Tracy's got a topic on the list on our docket here, and I want to wait until she's back because it's kind of a doozy. So stay tuned for that, whichever week that'll be. But hopefully 2 weeks from now. Quick reminder, or if you're here for the first time, a pre-minder. Shop Talk is basically it's Monday evening, at least on the East Coast. Time to kick back, maybe do a little water cooler talk, probably data platform related. This is generally chat driven, so get your chat in chat, and then we'll chat about it. And if you have questions, data platform related, drop them in there. We'll do our best to provide serious looking and possibly serious sounding answers that may even work if you're real lucky. But tonight, a couple things wanted to talk about. First thing is that SQL Server 2022 Release Candidate 0 is now available. That came out on the 23rd, so just under 1 week ago. And now that that's available, what it generally portends is that we're pretty close to a SQL Server 2022 Rtm release. I mean, we knew that it was going to be in the year 2022. Otherwise, it'd be real embarrassing if 2022 shipped in 2023. Last time that happened was SQL Server 2005, which did ship in the year 2005, but didn't ship with all of the stuff that they said it was going to because they weren't done with it yet. So they pretty much immediately had a big update right after, and I think that was in January of 2006. So I would expect SQL Server 2022 is going to ship. I'm going to preface this. I have zero information about dates. I don't know when it officially comes out. I don't know unofficially when it comes out. About the only thing I can tell you, it's got the year 2022, so December 31st, probably a safe bet. And also, historically, meaning go back to SQL Server 2008, 2012, 2016, 17, and 19, maybe even 14. I forgot about 14. But usually, you have RC0, you probably have an RC1, maybe you've got a 2. I don't remember there being too many RC3s, and usually the cadence was anywhere from like 4 to 6 weeks between release candidates. At least that's what I have in my mind. So if you want to guesstimate when does SQL Server 2022 come out, you start putting together, doing all that math, having the symbols and letters and numbers floating around your head as you're pondering real hard. Well, a couple of dates that I want to throw out. Microsoft Ignite is, when is that? October. It's in mid-October. Past Summit is in mid-November. And you figure if we have RC0 now, we could have an RC1 in September, RC2 in October, or RTM in October, or RTM in November. Maybe December, but probably, given how they released 2019, 2016, maybe 2017. Again, the exact dates I forget at this point, but I do recall a couple of releases happening either at Ignite or Summit. So we know based on historical precedent that they do like to release at big conferences, which is why I figure probably sometime in October, sometime in November. things are shaping up that way, given that we do have an RC0. RC0 didn't have a whole lot in terms of what's new in SQL Server. We're at a point now where usually with release candidates, we see a lot of bug fixes and we see fairly minor things. It's uncommon that you'll see a big feature addition slip into an RC. It has happened, but RC0 didn't have any of that.
Was that what pushed 2005?
No, 2005 was they built a whole lot of new stuff. I mean, that was when we switched over to SQL Server Management Studio. That was when there were a lot of new things added to the product. Integration services came out of DTS, Data Transformation Services. They extended SQL Server Analysis Services. They bought Crystal licensing for Crystal Reports, if I remember right, and built reporting services. So all of these new things came in, and there were a few things that were released in SP1 that were announced that they would be part of the initial build. I don't think too many of those were related to ancillary services, though I have a sticking feeling in my brain that something big related to integration services was part of that Service Pack 1. But again, that was 17 years ago, and actually before I even got started with SQL Server, so I was not around for that event.
Well, it wasn't a leap year, so they didn't get that one extra day. So
that probably did it.
Yep.
Yeah, always released on leap years. That's what we're getting at. I think also part of it was that it had been so long since the prior release, because SQL Server 2000 was the prior version, and before that they had a cadence of about every 2 to 3 years. This big 5-year gap happened, and then after that 5-year gap, you had 2008, 2010 for R2, 2012, 14, 16, 17, 19, 22. So back to the 2 to 3 year cadence for most of the releases.
They were busy working on pets.com.
That could be. Microsoft Encarta needed a bunch of updates. So, funny thing about 2005 and that big gap between them, you could tell that there was a big gap because there's actually a pirated version called SQL Server 2003, which was really SQL Server 2000, where they added a splash screen and then sold it as a different product. And by they, I don't mean Microsoft. I mean people who pirated copies of SQL Server 2000, relabeled it, and released it. So the funny thing is, I have more than once in my life seen people with resumes that list SQL Server 2003 on it. To which I have wondered, how much time did you spend in SQL Server 2003? I'm very interested in your skills with this product, considering that it never existed.
They wanted to see if you were paying attention. It was a reverse scam.
Maybe I should do that one of these days. Just put that I know all about SQL Server 2003 on my resume. Have that be the only version listed, like versions of SQL Server 2003. But yeah, that was how you could tell that it had been too long since between releases. So, if I were a betting man, and sometimes I am, my bets would be sometime between Ignite and Past Summit. And I don't know if it's going to be the earlier date or the later date. We're lined up to where I could see either one being a legitimate case. We're probably going to get an RC1, given the timing. My guess is an RC1 would drop sometime in mid to late September. That gives 3 to 4 weeks between releases. And whether we get an RC2 is going to depend on, do we go RTM in October, November, or is something bad happen and it slips till December? I mean, that's also a possibility that, hey, could be released in December. I think that's unlikely, but stranger things have happened. So closing that up with another statement that, again, I seriously don't know when this is being released. I'm not being coy about it. Not like, haha, I secretly know, but I can't tell you. Nope, got no idea. Have not asked, do not want to know. Because that way I can't accidentally say it out loud. So, SQL Server 2022, though, should have some interesting features. On that note, we're going to transition topics and talk a little bit about a talk that I'm giving tomorrow. Yeah, we're going there. I don't do this very often, but this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart and has burned me too many times. Data virtualization in SQL Server 2022, and talking a bit about how that changes. And there are some pretty big changes that have come into the product. So I'm doing this for the DBA Fundamentals group. That's going to be hosted tomorrow at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. The meetup link is there. It's a free meetup. Anybody is welcome to attend, and I'll go into a lot of detail on data virtualization options that are available in SQL Server 2022. I had a talk that I had built for 2019, and have been writing off of that one for a little while. Completely revamped it because there's a lot that has changed with data virtualization in SQL Server 2022 to the point where I can't even call it Polybase anymore. There is still Polybase, but it's not all Polybase anymore. And so for shop talk tonight, I'll talk just a little bit about that. We can talk history because I'm not going to be able to do too much in the way of history in the session tomorrow. So for people who are not familiar with this, which is most people because Polybase was never a very popular topic, ask me how I know. I have the book sales to prove it.
You've gone out to 6 book sales or 5? What was it?
I definitely have dozens of books sold.
Oh, okay. I thought, well, that was because I was listening to the 2020 0420 shop talk from two years ago. So you tripled your sales, which is
at least trebled. Yeah. I'm definitely up above a dozen. Probably more than 2 dozen. It was. This was never going to be a big seller, but you know what? That's okay. So people who are not familiar, big concept of data virtualization is my data lives somewhere else, but I want to pretend that it lives here, where here it can be a SQL Server, or of course, there are other platforms that provide data virtualization. So my data lives somewhere else. I want to pretend that it lives here. Got a couple of ways I can do that. One is I can actually make it live here. I can move the data over. That's where we get into ETL, ELT. It's data processing, data movement. And now the data lives here. I can query it. It's here. I may have to build extensive processes to keep that data up to date. I may have to test that my data updates are in fact working as I expected, that the data on one side is the same as the data on the other side. But by the end of it, I still get to where I want to be with my data in SQL Server. However, if I don't want to build this vast ETL process and take the data over, let's just say I want it to live over in that other place, but I want to pretend that it's SQL. Well, that's where data virtualization comes in. We create these notions like external tables and say, hey, this external table, this is a SQL Server table of a certain shape, except the data doesn't live in my SQL Server. It actually lives over here in Oracle. It lives over here in Teradata, in Cosmos DB, in a Spark cluster, on flat files, Excel files, Postgres, Cassandra lives in wherever you want it to be, Azure Blob Storage, S3, whatever. And we're going to retrieve that data. We're going to act like it lives in SQL Server, let you query it, let you write any kind of T-SQL that you want, and get back results that you would expect. The main downside to data virtualization is really, really slow because you are paying to move the data over. And quite often, if you can't filter the data down on the source side extremely well, You're bringing a whole lot of data over, getting rid of almost all of it, and then returning that tiny bit. But the cost of taking all this data over and then filtering it down, pretty significant, especially because you have to do that every time you run the query. There's no caching. There's no temporary storage of data. SQL Server big data clusters actually did put together a notion of caching where you could write a query from an external table and essentially cache it in as a real table for a little bit and then refresh that cache. That never made it to SQL Server, the box product. And if you were to do it, you would essentially write your own. You would use Polybase in that case as building out an ELT process. But we have this notion of data virtualization. It goes back to 2008 or so. And there were some early papers by Dr. David DeWitt, who was, at the time was with Microsoft Research, and came up with this Polybase project. The idea was they wanted to have Hadoop and SQL Server and some integration between the two. That there were some customers who had Hadoop clusters, they had SQL servers, they wanted the two to communicate. And ideally wanted to be able to write SQL statements against their data that's stored in Hadoop. This turned into the Parallel Data Warehouse platform. Later on became APS. After that, got clouditized, became Azure SQL Data Warehouse, is now the Azure Synapse Analytics dedicated SQL pool. I've still, to this day, never seen a Parallel Data Warehouse or APS server in existence. I know Mala has seen them in person. I've never seen one. I do not have enough money to even think about that product, nor have I ever worked at a company that had enough money to think about that product. So, them's the breaks. But we have this idea that, hey, we'll have Hadoop communicate with SQL Server. And that's where Polybase came out of. The idea was take a T-SQL statement, turn it into a MapReduce job, and have that MapReduce job execute against the Hadoop cluster. Well, that MapReduce job runs, it crunches all of the data, it performs whatever filtering is necessary, it performs whatever aggregations are necessary, takes those results, and can stream them back to a SQL Server. And in fact, you could go one step further. You could scale out and have multiple SQL servers communicate with multiple data nodes over on the Hadoop side. So the different workers, the machines that hold the data, and have them interact directly. Giving you this idea of massive parallel processing. I have scale out on the Hadoop side. I have scale out on the SQL Server side. Instead of waiting for the data nodes over on the Hadoop side to get all of their work together, perform whatever shuffling, sorting, filtering, aggregation, processing they need to do, write it into one folder that the control node can go over and say, hey, job's a good one. That SQL Server could just say, okay, we've sent the job over. Now, all of our SQL Server nodes are going to communicate directly with your workers and get the data as soon as possible. Smart idea. Very interesting concept. Pretty complex to work out. But it was a key part of Parallel Data Warehouse and APS. SQL Server 2016 comes out, and they release it to the broader public. It supported Hadoop and anything that ran Web HDFS, like Azure Blob Storage, over the WASB protocol. And so we could write queries against Azure Blob Storage and against Hadoop. Hadoop, you could either read directly from HDFS, or you could go through the control node, run a MapReduce job, get your data processed, and get the results back. Big difference being that if you access HDFS directly, you're essentially streaming the whole file over, processing it in SQL Server, and then getting your results. If you do the MapReduce job, you're building a MapReduce job, sending that code over, have it process over here, get the results, send it back. That latter job has about a half minute to minute spin up time. But if you have an enormous amount of data that you're processing and getting back a relatively small amount, probably a lot cheaper than streaming hundreds of millions or billions of rows over to a SQL Server temp table and then processing it in SQL Server. So there was a reason to do this. 2017 comes out, not much changes with Polybase. A little bit changes, but not very much. 2019 comes out, big difference. 2019 sort of gets you to what I call V2, and that is ODBC. Polybase with ODBC. This is where we got the ability to connect to other SQL servers, to Oracle, to Teradata, MongoDB, to literally anything that has an ODBC connector. As long as that ODBC connector works with SQL Server, which it took a while. At RTM, a bunch of stuff didn't work. Like, for example, Microsoft's Access Redistributable didn't work with Polybase and SQL Server 2019. The Access Redistributable, before people start thinking, yes, but Kevin, why are you querying an Access database? Are you really that daft? The answer is sometimes, but the Access Redistributable includes an Excel driver, the official Microsoft Excel driver. The official Microsoft Excel driver did not work with the official technology from Microsoft for data virtualization in SQL Server. And that seemed like a bit of a miss, especially because there was a third-party ODBC driver from CData that worked perfectly. So in the book that I wrote, that released shortly after RTM. Actually, it may not even have been RTM before I got the final version to print. It was right around that time. And so in the book, I even talk about in Excel, yep, use this driver from CData because the Access Redistributable does not work. They fixed that in a later CU for SQL Server. So now you can use the Access Redistributable driver and you can use Excel. You can actually even use it to read flat files. So flat files on disk, like CSVs, you can use that to read from there and do data processing. There are better ways to do that, but it's an option. So really cool things. Oh, go ahead.
What's after RTM? Is that like a service pack? Like what would even come after that?
Well,
as of be a fix.
As of 2019, they stopped doing service packs altogether. I think as of 2017. But with 2019, no service packs. It's all cumulative updates, CUs. So we're at CU 17, I believe. But it's all cumulative updates, usually released about once every month or two. The cadence slows down as a product gets a little older. So it started out, they had a CU basically every month, and now it's every couple of months. As 2019 ages further, they'll have fewer CUs per cycle, and eventually they'll just stop creating CUs for it.
They'll put it on the vision board for 2025.
Right, something like that. So 2019 had a lot of really cool stuff in it. But it was all read-only. So one of the things that you could do with Polybase in 2016 is insert. I could insert data. You couldn't update. You couldn't delete. It's append only. Because what it does really is it creates new files and writes those files into HDFS or into Azure Blob Storage. But I was able to insert. Really good for data archival scenarios. Like I have a big table that I want to archive off to Blob Storage because I don't really need that data anymore. Maybe I need it for auditing purposes. I need to hold on to it, but I don't actively use that data. Well, I can write it to Blob Storage and get it off of my really fast, really expensive all-flash arrays that are running SQL Server on premises, and just have it be up in Blob Storage, or move it over to HDFS, where again I probably have cheaper disk. Not a bad idea. The insert pattern allowed you to do that, but again, you couldn't update, you couldn't delete. And 2019, all of those connections to SQL Server, to Oracle, to MongoDB, to Cosmos DB, to Excel, you cannot insert, update, delete data. It is read-only. The other oddity was that generic ODBC, so everything except for SQL Server, MongoDB, Oracle, Teradata, everything else, Windows only. You could not install generic ODBC drivers on Linux and have it work there. You could use the 4 big players, the built-in drivers for Linux, but you couldn't do Spark, Hadoop, Excel, anything like that. Even the Java driver for 2016 and 2017, my recollection is that didn't work for Linux, that it was really just the ODBC portion, but not generic ODBC. So Linux has kind of been an afterthought with Polybase, at least in my experience. But yeah, we had good times. Stuff got broken.
There's hardly any data stored in Linux.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, on the SQL Server side, that is true.
Right.
For the rest of the world, about that. But yeah, we had some fun with 2019. A lot of stuff broke. Some of it got fixed. Some of it got rebroken. I'm still angry. So I actually had to go back to my notes to remind myself. I had a blog post about this a long time ago. But SQL Server 2019 CU2 broke Windows Authentication with Polybase. What I mean by this, prior to 2019 CU2, so if you had any version of 2016, any version of 2017, 2019 RTM, I could use Windows Authentication, connect to my SQL Server instance, create an external data source, create an external file format, create an external table, select from external table. All of that stuff worked just fine. 2019 CU2 broke the world. If I tried to create an external data source or file format or table, or even select from an external table, you would get an error message that this login is from an untrusted domain. And it was a severity 20 error, which meant that it would kill your session. Boom, session's gone. You had to reconnect to start back up and do anything. Which meant that if you wanted to do any work around Polybase, you're using SQL Authentication at this point. There's no Windows Authentication supported. Later CUs fixed it partially. So by CU5, if I remember right, of 2019, it was no longer a severity 20 error. It was a severity 16 error. So it would give you an error, but at least it wouldn't kill your session. It would allow you to change to SQL Authentication session and do whatever work you wanted to do. CU6 fixed the problem if you're on a domain. So if you're using an Active Directory domain account, then this would work. But if you're running a standalone SQL Server instance in a work group, like basically every desktop user, everybody who's trying out SQL Server, probably even some small companies, Windows Authentication would still break. So that was where things stood. So SQL Server 2022, there's a lot of change in data virtualization. First thing is the original Polybase, the David DeWitt Polybase, that's dead. Java connector, no longer required, which is a good thing. Integration with Hadoop, gone. Integration with blob storage through WebHDFS, gone. We still have ODBC. We still have those 2019 data sources. So that's Polybase at this point. We also have a new data virtualization that has come in It's not Polybase, and that allows you to connect to more of APIs than ODBC. What we have right now in RC0, we can connect to Azure Blob Storage, Azure Data Lake Storage, and Amazon S3. File-based storage systems. So all of that Azure Blob Storage stuff, a little bit has changed under the covers. Well, a lot has changed under the covers. A little bit has changed in the way that we structure external data sources. I think on the whole, that's a positive. Getting rid of the Java driver is a smart idea at this point. And the way that Polybase worked with Hadoop was not going to be viable at this point. So remember way back when I used the hand puppets and I was showing that these are your data nodes over in Hadoop. These are your SQL Server instances, and that they would communicate with each other. Well, they communicate with each other over a series of open ports. And that works perfectly well when you have a Hadoop cluster on premises, you have a SQL Server set of SQL servers on premises, and you have no problem opening up firewall ports. This supported two distributions of Hadoop, the Cloudera distribution of Hadoop and the Hortonworks data platform, CDH and HDP. Well, fast forward to somewhere around the year 2017, and Hortonworks and Cloudera merged together to form the new Cloudera. And they released their Cloudera data platform, CDP. The Cloudera data platform has never been released on premises. It is a cloud-only solution as far as I can tell. And therefore, they're not going to open up all the arbitrary ports that would allow SQL Server instances to communicate with the data nodes over in Hadoop. Similarly, HD Insight for Azure never opened up those ports. So you couldn't have predicate pushdown. You couldn't have the performance gains from Polybase writing those MapReduce jobs and communicating with the Hadoop cluster. That entire model changed because Hadoop clusters, to the extent that they did not entirely go away, generally migrated into the cloud. Most of the time, though, they went away. They've been replaced with Spark clusters. They've been replaced with Kafka clusters. A lot of the Hadoop ecosystem has broken out into smaller components. You no longer have the notion of the big Hadoop server with 55 services running on it and just sharing that compute, sharing that disk. And instead, you have a lot more smaller purpose-driven services, which reflects the maturity of the market, that it's no longer a bunch of kind of sort of tied together services, that it's instead, I need this thing, and therefore this service will provide it to me. So I need a logging solution. Kafka provides it to me. I need in-memory compute, or I need compute, but I need it to be fast. Spark cluster using Databricks, or Spark cluster using Synapse, or Elastic MapReduce, or whatever. Generally, you're looking at Spark clusters, not Hadoop. So the market changed. The original Polybase just wasn't going to work anymore. And therefore, get rid of the Java requirements, get rid of the original code. I have no problem. I'm okay with that. I went through the 12 steps of grief real fast on that one. But there are some things so far in 2022 RC0 that I have noticed, and I actually have a whole series of blog posts coming up over the next couple of weeks on them. One of the ones that I'm going to share now, since I talked about authentication's broken again. So 2019 CU6, it became working for domain accounts. CU5, at least it wasn't a severity 20 error. I just tried 2022 RC0, and what's real interesting is sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And this is, are you using Polybase or are you using Microsoft's newer data virtualization. If you're using Polybase, like you want to create an external data source to a SQL Server or to Oracle or wherever, and you're using a Windows authenticated account, so not Active Directory, but Windows integrated authentication, hard error, severity 20. You're gone. Get out of here. Yeah, exactly. Now, by contrast, if you connect to Azure Blob Storage, you can create that external data source using Windows authentication. You can create the file format. You can create the external table. You can select from the external table. You can do everything. It'll work perfectly fine. So I think that'll confuse people because the two data virtualization technologies use exactly the same syntax. You can't tell from create external data source, create external file format, create external table. Am I using Polybase? Am I using this new data virtualization? It's the same interface for us. And where it gets real interesting is external file format switched from Polybase to not Polybase, which meant if you're running 2019 RTM, please tell me you're not running 2019 RTM. Please tell me you've upgraded. You've patched it. RTM had a whole bunch of bugs. But suppose you are. You're back to 2019 RTM, and you say create external file format for Parquet. You will get a hard error in Windows if you're using Windows authentication when you try to run that command. 2022 works just fine because external file format was tied to Polybase v1. It was tied to that Hadoop and Azure Blob Storage. All of that code is deprecated. All of that is gone. This is actually one of the rare cases where Microsoft is actually taking code out. And they needed to take it out because it was all Java-based. So that whole path is dead. 2022, create external file format doesn't use the same code, apparently doesn't do the same checks for Windows integrated authentication that breaks Polybase, and so it works just fine. Which means that two people may experience completely different outcomes because one of them has an external data source of SQL Server, one of them has an external data source of S3. And the one using S3 is like, no, it works perfectly fine on my machine. Maybe you need to reinstall your copy of SQL Server or something. Maybe you have a bug. So weird behavior. I'm trying to catalog and document as much of that as I can. I have a good 5 blog posts in the queue already. I've got a couple more that are on my to-do list. Gonna try to write them up, get them out over the next couple of weeks while it's still fresh in my mind.
Can I use SQL Server Express still?
For what?
Is it gonna break? This is all non-enterprise features, right?
Oh yeah. As of SQL Server 2016 SP1, the development namespace, that development space is all the same. So the difference between enterprise and non-enterprise at this point is mostly around administrative features. Building indexes online, partitioning tables, some
having
stuff
more than
around
one CPU, right? Like having multiple CPUs.
Multiple CPUs are still allowed in standard edition. You get up to 20 cores. You could have that be on multiple CPUs if you have a motherboard that supports multi-CPU. So there it's just a core count that they cap you at. Express Edition, yeah, I think you're capped at 1 core. Certain amount of RAM. Maybe it's more than 1 core, but I know that you're capped at a certain amount of RAM and 10 gigabytes of disk space for your drive, for your MDF files. So there are some basically the same hard limits on Express Edition, but as far as development process goes, yeah, you could create external tables with Polybase on Express Edition. I think if I remember right, you were limited in some of the capabilities, but for the most part, my recollection is you could do whatever you wanted, development space-wise. Even in-memory OLTP, column store indexes, clustered column store indexes, all those fun things that have come out over the past few years. That stuff's available in every edition. It's simply a matter of how much sense it makes to use, and also some of the administrative side, the things that make it easier or reduce your amount of time that you're spending on building something. That's Enterprise Edition. That's why you're paying the big bucks. But yeah, so that's coming out over the next couple of weeks, and admittedly, it was kind of fun to get back into Polybase and data virtualization for SQL Server 2022. I had not tried it through the CTPs. I just been too busy. But I remembered that I talked the data virtualization, or excuse me, the DBA fundamentals group into doing this talk. And like, yeah, I'm sure that by this time, 2022 will be out and we'll have some cool stuff for data virtualization, or at least some variant of 2022, some CTP or RC would be out, and that I could show that off. And then when I checked the title and realized that, oh, I committed myself to that, didn't I? So spent a lot of time the last several days reacquainting myself with Polybase and changing literally dozens of scripts. Many of them were minor changes. Some of them were pretty big changes. So even if you do know how to use Polybase in prior versions of SQL Server, probably still a good idea to check it out. I don't know if the meeting's going to be recorded. It might very well be. Even if it's not recorded, I'm positive I'm going to give this talk again at some point, because nobody else will. I mean, that's kind of mean. There are several people who do Polybase related talks or data virtualization talks. It's only several people, but
Were they all written in Java and they've been deprecated?
No. Actually, so most of the Polybase related talks came out in SQL Server 2019, and it was mostly ignoring the Hadoop and Azure Blob Storage part of it, the stuff that was actual Polybase. 2019 Polybase, the code was very different, I guess, because a lot of the behavior seemed to be different. You did not need Java. So if you only use the 2019 version, no Java requirement, which is part of why it's still there in 2022. Even in 2019, you had two separate checkboxes. One that was the V2 components, one that was the Java connector for those V1 things. So different code bases, and as an aside comment, there was an Israeli company that Microsoft purchased several years back, whose entire job was their main product was data virtualization and working with ODBC connectors.
Yeah, that's my day-to-day. I'd have to do a lot of that stuff, connecting ODBC stuff in it. Sometimes it's pretty old, but it works.
Yeah. Oh, some of those drivers. Yeah. This weekend, I learned about the Cosmos DB driver for the core SQL interface. And if you install it, it's not Cosmos DB, it's Document DB. It was updated in 2019. Before, I think that was even after Document DB was renamed to Cosmos DB. But there are a lot of Microsoft APIs and packages that are Cosmos DB related that still say Document DB. That one's still one of them. The last time that driver was updated was a good 3 years ago. It still worked. No problem with it. But it was funny seeing that name, Document DB, there. Yep. You guys didn't even make a cosmetic release where you just renamed the driver.
I do data with pharmacy sometimes, and I get Walgreens data that says Rite Aid because they bought Rite Aid years ago, but they still use their own system, so you
Oh, sure.
just get Rite Aid data.
Yeah, it took. I remember flying on American Airlines flights that still had the U.S. Airways trait. What were they? The flight attendant push carts were still logoed U.S. Airways. Some of the interior designs of planes still said U.S. Airways in them. The outside livery was all American Airlines, but yeah, there was like a 6-year period where they were still running on separate systems, where for most purposes they were still essentially different airline companies that just both happened to have the same name. And my belief is that has mostly been papered over by this point, because I've done some flying recently and haven't hit the U.S. Airways stuff, even on older planes. So I think they cycled out enough of those old planes, the old U.S. Airways planes, that they were able to replace all the logos.
I like that. Yeah, if you ignore a problem long enough, it just goes away sometimes. Strategic. Oh, that plane's going to get retired. We don't need to paint it. First, they tried just putting a banner on it, and every time they flew, it just fell off. Then they took paint and just crossed it out.
This is where I wish Andrews was in chat tonight, because I think the exterior paint is required by FAA. I'm gonna guess that it's a preventative measure for any type of corrosion. That's my guess.
I'm sure for visual ID standards too. Boats and planes all have serial numbers and stuff. And
oh yeah,
in an emergency, you have to be able to look up and see what
the tail number,
which one is which.
Yeah, for sure. But I don't think I'm making that up about paint being required. So I think even things like scratches on the exterior, they have to be painted over to prevent. And I know there are aluminum bodies or carbon fiber bodies, but so you're not going to rust on the outside. But I think there is corrosion related reasons not to leave those planes unpainted.
I know that's true in space. You don't want any holes, any size.
Generally not. I've seen Space 1999. I know how that all turns out.
Yeah, I'll stay down here. Thanks.
Oh, that was an awful show, by the way. Your hot take of the night: Space 1999 was a terrible show. I like Martin Landau and Barbara Bain as actors. Man, that was a horrible show. They did not need to leave Mission Impossible for that show, I tell you what. So since we're already swirling the drain at this point, one more thing we're going to talk about tonight. LastPass confirms internal source code compromised in security breach. So this story came out, and if you're using LastPass, you probably got an email that indicates that, oh, don't worry, everything was fine. Turns out that they lost their internal source code and technical documentation. And don't worry, nobody has accessed, or no, it wasn't that nobody had accessed. It was, we have no, what is the exact statement? I gotta see. We have achieved a state of containment, blah, blah, blah. We see no further evidence of unauthorized activity. They had some comment in there that was, we have no evidence of them having accessed the customer the password vaults. It's like, yes, just because you have no evidence doesn't mean that it didn't happen. Absence of evidence is not existence, or is not proof of the non-existence of something. So, kind of sucks if you're a LastPass user. I am. Might want to change that master password and hope that, nobody does anything like putting malicious software into the LastPass code that does something bad. Because the way that it does work, assuming that the code does not get altered, then there's not much that LastPass itself knows as a company. They don't have your master passwords. All of the stuff is encrypted before being sent to them. So they don't have the keys themselves to decrypt your passwords, which means if you ever lose your master password, you are hosed.
Yeah, they make that very clear. We switched from LastPassword to 1Password recently, and I deleted my whole vault. But so I was like, "Oh boy, that was good timing." But yeah, they make it very clear that you're on your own, pal. You better save this. Be a grown up now.
Yep, and I have no problem at all with that. That is my preference. I don't want them to have any ability to reset a password, because resetting a password means that someone's got the ability to decrypt all of your passwords and re-encrypt them using a password that's one that you don't know. So that is a built-in vulnerability. So happy that that's true. However, the problem that I see is, yes, this is with the code that is currently there, but somebody was able to steal your code, your source code, your technical documentation. Is it possible that somebody is able to, I don't know, pull a SolarWinds, update the deployment process somehow, slip in a malicious version of code somewhere downstream, and thereby infect people without them knowing? And then at that point, maybe what that code does is it doesn't just keep everything local. It says, oh, now that you've decrypted, let me send that password out to some other service. Let me send it out to some website and collect a whole bunch of passwords. Not great. Not great. But I guess that's the cost of not having the same password on every website, or of having a notepad file on one desktop computer. Yeah. Basically,
multi-factor is annoying, but I started using that for most everything. Not that not that anything's fit, but and I got some credit monitoring too, so that was.
I've reached a point where multi-factor is acceptable evil for most everything. I'm not a huge fan of tying everything to your phone, which is a device that is easy to lose, steal, or break.
Yep.
But I know that there are, for example, keys like this, where you can generate one-time tokens. So that's kind of useful, kind of helpful for websites and for services and products that support it, of course. But yeah, having that sort of secondary factor going to be a lot better for you in the long run. Even if it is on your phone, it's okay, fine. I have my phone with me basically all the time.
One of my accounts goes to my wife by accident because she was out of town and I ordered myself some pizza, and then the pizza confirmation went to her and she texted it to me and I was like, busted.
Ha.
That's for tomorrow. It was salad.
Right.
Who's ordering pizza? It wasn't me. Rejected.
But wait 20 minutes until it gets delivered before you reject it.
Pizza and mozzarella sticks. Whoa. Couldn't be me.
Oh no, the mozzarella sticks were free. Don't worry. They were on sale. Yeah, I've even got one or two services that are tied to an old phone, just because I don't know how to get them over to the new phone.
Oh, I have that. I won't give this one up because it's small, and they don't make small ones anymore.
Hmm.
So it's like my iPad, my iPod, or something like that. But it doesn't have a SIM card.
I do
And
actually.
I hate huge phones.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. No, there are no medium-sized phones anymore, much less small phones. It's all large, extra large, and grande. I do have an old phone because one of my banking services, they haven't updated their software since 2 or 3 Android versions ago. Which, for banking software, that of course sounds like a real winner. But don't worry, you can always mail your checks to them. The whole reason I picked you as a bank is because that way I could take photos of my checks and it would be in my account and it would be easy to work with. And I've been with them long enough that I don't want to move. So I have this phone. I turn it on when I need to take photos of checks. And then I turn it back off because it's an old phone.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. Yeah, because I use a bank that's pretty modern because it was kind of online only, and I've been very spoiled. And then I got a more local bank, a credit union, and they don't really have the same level of technology, and I was frustrated. I don't blame them. Yeah, I hear you.
Yeah. But I suppose it's probably enough old man yells at cloud for tonight. Here comes Extra Mike. You re-requested to join right when we were about to kick out. Well, poor Mike. Now that Mike is in limbo, we've broken him. And I don't think he can hear or see us anymore. So what we're going to do, we're going to call it quits for the night. A couple minutes early, but mostly because I've run out of topics. And there goes Mike. So next time we're going to meet again will be the second week of September. Second Tuesday of September, we're going to have our advanced DBA group. Third Tuesday of September, we've got our main meeting. Fourth Tuesday of September, BI and data science group. So check those out. All of that, meetup.com/trypass. Next episode of Shop Talk will be 2 weeks from now. Next Monday is Labor Day, and we wouldn't be doing Shop Talk that Monday anyhow, but good to call it out. So with that, we're going to wrap things up for tonight. On behalf of Mike, who dropped out and just sent me a text message saying that he had been kidnapped by ninjas, I'm going to say, everybody, take care.